All right, hi everybody. We're just going to give it another minute or two here to let people trickle in, and then we'll get started. For those of you just joining, we're just going to wait another minute, just letting people trickle in, and we'll start. I think we'll start right at 10:05. All right, I think we can go and get started. So thanks everybody for joining us. I'm excited to have Jit Kee Chin here with me, and she is the Chief Data and Innovation Officer and Executive Vice President at Suffolk Construction. So extremely excited to have her. I am Matt Ohlman. If you were expecting to see Nick here, sorry you're stuck with me. Nick had a family emergency come up, so he couldn't join today. But I'm going to take over instead, and I am the CTO at Shadow Ventures. Shadow Ventures is a seed stage technology venture capital firm, and we are focused primarily on the AEC and CRE tech startup market. So with that, I think we can just jump in. Jit Kee, do you mind just starting out? Give us a quick background on you and your role at Suffolk, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you very much, Matt. And hi, everyone. Glad to be here with you today. So as Matt says, I am the Chief Data and Innovation Officer for Suffolk Construction. My role is to kind of help drive Suffolk on its next stage of its kind of data transformation journey, and to help bring innovative technologies, techniques, and data applications to the core business. For those of you that don't know us, Suffolk is a general contractor based out of headquartered in Boston, but with a national footprint. We're in the top 25 of ENR GCs, and we primarily do kind of vertical commercial build. So a large portfolio in many of the dense urban areas in the US. And we are constantly pushing to build in new and different ways that mitigate risk, ways that drives efficiencies, and ways that just help us do the same thing, but better, right? In search of that is kind of when we set up specific data and innovation teams and departments to actually always help us look at the next kind of what's next on the horizon. Since about a year ago, I also led the formation and stand up of our corporate ventures group. So here we partner with other institutional funds to actually take investments in startups that we believe is bringing in a new technology or a new way of doing things further out in the future. And we take investments in them mainly to partner and to align long-term incentives so that jointly we can develop ways of building better. So that's a little bit of who I am and what I do. I'm going to start off by apologizing for not being on video. I know it's probably better practice to be on video for these kinds of things, but internet bandwidth in my region is not what it should be. And my experiences in large video calls like this, you'll have a better experience if I stay on voice.
Yep, no problem. We've all got our our COVID woes here. So thanks for your introduction. So I want to start. I'm really fascinated by your background. You have a PhD in physics from MIT. Yeah, I think it's safe to say you could do literally anything. So I'm curious what drew you into the construction industry.
Yeah, good question. You know, my background was that I started with a PhD in physics at MIT, but career changes are sort of not new to me. When I graduated, I actually went into management consulting with McKinsey and stayed with them for nearly 10 years. First out of the London office before coming back to Boston. And then shortly after I came back, I joined Suffolk for the opportunity of leading a data transformation within Suffolk and more broadly within the construction industry. And then much more recently took over the innovation portfolio. I think what drew me to the construction industry is a couple of things. One, you know, the built environment is so much a part of our daily lives. And I suspect a lot of us feel it very much now when we are confined to one very specific built environment, which is kind of our homes, and do not have the same opportunities to sort of interact and work and play in other types of environments, right? Like work and entertainment spaces. So I really liked being a part of a company that shapes that environment and shapes therefore the impact on our physical, mental, and emotional well-being on a very tangible fashion. I think the other aspect of what drew me to the industry is the opportunity, is what I call the point in time evolution of a given industry. So my passion is data. And the passion there is like, how can data help run things better, more efficiently, mitigate risk, etc. And so when I looked at construction and where it was as an industry within the data journey, it felt like it was not one of the first mover industries. It felt like there was a lot of impact that could be made if I joined and brought some of my learnings from other industries in that I kind of was exposed to as a management consultant and brought it to the construction industry. So concepts like real-time dashboarding, concepts like data interoperability, concepts like just statistical forecasting for risk mitigation and whatnot, I think were not widely adopted at that 3 years ago when I joined. And so I felt that there was an opportunity to come in and lead that change.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it kind of brings me, to my next question. I feel like, it's 2020. A lot of AEC firms are starting to slowly realize kind of the value of data and what it brings to the table and how it can help, drive efficiencies and increase the bottom line and all that good stuff. I think Suffolk is probably on the kind of latter half of that, innovation spectrum. I'd say you guys are significantly ahead of most of your peers. But, I think one thing that's really challenging that, people who may not necessarily have such a rich background in data science like yourself may not quite realize is that the data analysis and the part of actually analyzing the data is one thing. It certainly is a challenge, but there's also a challenge on the front half of that, which is how do you get the data, how do you organize the data, how do you store the data, and I feel like in AEC those things are really very big hurdles. So how do your team get around some of those things, and what tricks have you found that help with that?
Yeah, that was a really good question, and that's the majority of the journey. I think a lot of people talk about data science as the exciting, new, innovative things. But so much of the work, that's just the tip of the iceberg. So much of the work is actually in what you just outlined, the storage, the infrastructure, and frankly, the process of capturing the data itself, I'd say is a massive pain point, because in construction, particularly in the segment of construction that we're in, historically, it's been a very entrepreneurial environment. And systems adherence or process adherence isn't necessarily top of the mind. You do what you need to do to get the job done. And it's a very fluid environment out on the job, requiring a lot of active problem solving. And what tends to fall by the wayside is then kind of good data entry hygiene, for want of a better word, right? And in the past, maybe there was no point to it, right? You get done with a project, you build it, you close it. But with new methods of analysis and with the ability to learn from our past mistakes and to get aggregate insights from a lot of different projects, I think the onus to actually capture information in a way that can be looked at across a portfolio becomes more important, and will actually help drive change rather than, sort of do individual project by project. So I completely agree with you that. Go on.
You go ahead.
So I was just going to say it's completely a major challenge. So how have we overcome it? I think what we learned early, so there's like the rule book of how you overcome it, right? You go to someone like a Gartner or anyone that sort of focuses on these type of technical transformations, and they say, well, you need a whole bunch of initiatives. You need like a governance council because you need to resolve kind of challenges in terms of when you say, how much land area I have, you have a clear way of defining what land area means. Simple things like this, or what is a project in our industry. Actually defining what is a project may not be as straightforward as you think it is. So they'll say you need a data governance council, you need an architecture and infrastructure type of work stream to talk about where your data sits and what are the interconnections between it, as well as what, kind of golden line of truth across like unique identifiers and all of that. They'll talk about needing to run very closely with the business and get business guidance, direction, and leadership, frankly, in determining what is important, because unless you have clear prioritization and are working towards something, these efforts often get bogged down in the sheer complexity and tedium. So there's a whole long list of things that you'll do, but just to share some insights for the industry, I think what we found as we went through it in the last 3 years is for our industry, it's very important that end products be tangible and that you have a lot of quick wins along the way. And so what we found to be quite pragmatic is that you first have to make data transparent, even if it's wrong. And then that transparency drives a conversation, and it drives a cultural change that is needed for a broader transformation to take hold. So what we found is that the most effective things, dashboards that give you the transparency in terms of what people enter into systems, and exposes the process gaps where, maybe you aren't following your change management procedures accurately, maybe you aren't updating schedules or whatever it is regularly. Once you have that exposure, even if that is a process gap and not a reality, so for example, you actually did it, you just never entered it, that helps people to have the right conversations that say, okay, are we accurately capturing our risk? Are we accurately monitoring project progress? And if not, could we do that so that we can have a real reflection of where we are? And I think that drove a lot of, that first wave drove cleanup. And then when the data got better, it drove the conversation in the right place. Oh, this has been, we thought this wasn't a problem because when we look at it on a job by job basis, seems like there's all sorts of good reasons for it. But when you start aggregating trends and you start monitoring them on a rigorous level, then you start saying, well, why has this happened? What has systematically driven this particular trend? And therefore, what do we need to put in place so that we reverse the trend and so on? And I think that's also been very important because we are a project-driven business. We do a job, we believe that each job is different from another one. And it has been difficult to drive through enough consistency from a metrics definition and a metrics capture and then aggregation perspective to spot meaningful trends and draw insights. But transparency is first. Until you have that transparency, I think it's been difficult to get the concepts across. The other point I'd emphasize is culture. With transparency, you need to drive a culture where it's not a blame game, where you don't immediately point the finger if the information is not accurate or isn't what you expected. I think you have to embrace the concept that the data is there to drive a conversation, and then to improve the decision making and to take it from the gut, it's always been this way, or the experience, I know is so, to much more of a fact-based decision making culture.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So, when you're talking about, having dashboards and exposing data to people, even if it's wrong, is that something that you find helps kind of up the management chain with senior leadership, or does that actually trickle down to the field and help drive adoption there as well?
The nice thing about dashboards is that it's not a whole lot of effort to make it visible to different levels in the organization. So the way I think about dashboarding is that I view it as it's the same information that flows through different levels, just aggregated and synthesized differently, right? And so that's why when we first did dashboarding on the operational side, we made sure the project dashboard was the first dashboard we built, because that underpins everything that rolls up to the executive level and rolls back down. And we also made sure that the dashboards linked to the, we're a Procore customer, so it linked to the kind of Procore systems as well as our ERP systems for the financial management side. Because what the project will want to know very specifically is not just I have X% of RFIs open, it's like, which RFI is it that isn't getting resolved that's going to cause me an issue, right? And oftentimes people on the job will know a lot of that. So the metrics are more like a speedometer, a high-level speedometer to help them keep an eye on things. But the relevance gets much more important as you go up the executive chain, because at that point you're looking for trends and you're looking for, where you need to focus attention on. And oftentimes, if you don't have some kind of aggregation, you may not know. So, so when you ask about, is the information flowed down to the front line? Kind of absolutely the information is there. It's actually where we started. And so it's a two-way process. So if we set something as a priority on the executive level, we work to make sure that that priority is reflected in the numbers that the front line has access to and visibility of. And then from the front line, we have a process where we take their input in terms of what they find important and wish to see reflected, and we try and sort of build it in. The other thing that we try to do is to make these actually, the dashboards, the agenda of conversation. So every project will have weekly review cycles and whatnot. And if the dashboard sort of sits on the side and it's not part of the regular rhythm of the project, then it's not useful. But what teams have started doing is that they have started using them as almost the agenda placemat for conversations between project executives and VPs, or between VPs and CEOs and whatnot. Because on a page you have all the numbers, but then the conversation becomes, you know what, I need to highlight these 3 things on the job that's not going well. Here's what we're doing about it. And everybody comes prepared to the meetings because all the quote unquote materials are distributed in advance, and it becomes a conversation.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you feel like, and Suffolk may be, better at this than others, but I mean, do you feel like there are users kind of at a project level who just, they don't necessarily use the tools that are made available to them. They kind of go, quote unquote, go rogue, and kind of use their own tools. Like, do you feel like that? I feel like it's almost like cultural issues at some of these firms. But do you feel like that happens at Suffolk? And if so, how do you kind of mitigate that or stop that from happening?
Yeah, no, it absolutely happens, right? And my personal perspective is that you'll never stop that. And I don't know that we want to stop it, because in a way the projects can be a very good, they are on the ground, they know what works, they know what doesn't. They also have unique project characteristics. So one tool that works best for one project may not work for another one. And then finally, the owners drive a lot of this. So if an owner has kind of come in and said, this works really well, I want to use this and I'll pay for it, then the projects are going to use it, right? The way we overcome it is that we have a fairly kind of rigorous stage gating process for piloting solutions, where you go from 1 to maybe 2 or 3 to maybe then 5 or 10, and then a decision on whether or not you're going to scale something company-wide. When you scale something company-wide, the kind of mechanism that works is that you just make the financial incentives align, right? Like the way it tends to work is everybody if everybody has a fixed kind of IT overhead, and something that's scaled is in that IT overhead, for them to go out and use another tool, that's something they pay for. Whereas using something that's company standard that they pay for anyway, right? So I think just aligning those types of incentives, and there might be other creative ways to do it, I think that helps. I think in terms of then certain tools that are genuinely just more relevant for one job or one category of jobs versus another, I think you have to let the projects just experiment with that. I think on the data side, that's an easier conversation because ERPs are ERPs. Everybody has to put the financials into some system. So that is a standard system. And then occasionally when we have pilots for, new construction collaboration platforms or whatnot, we know about those, we just monitor them, and we value the feedback that comes from people constantly trying new things so that the next time we have a ERP review or a collaboration platform review, we can incorporate that feedback.
Yeah, that's great. So when you run a pilot on say a new construction collaboration platform, how important is it that you can access the data kind of programmatically from that pilot, or do you wait to kind of roll that data up into your larger data strategy? Do you wait until that goes enterprise-wide?
We keep pretty close eye on pilots. So, from a piloting strategy, and it's a bit different from the data strategy, right? Because like dashboard building, there are different levels of dashboards, but the company standard dashboards are necessarily built in the center, and then other people in the different functions, if they have the capability, are free to build smaller dashboards for their own usage. But if you're talking pilots of construction solutions, right, like a remote monitoring camera, like a sort of like a new scheduling or short-term planning tool or whatever it is. We have invested in what we have now rebranded as our co-labs, collaboration labs, in each of our regional offices, which are tech-enabled collaboration spaces where we scale out solutions, test and scale out solutions. People come in there, people learn how to use the technology. Each one is staffed by a construction solutions director that actually help people navigate between a suite of tools that we already have vetted out in different places, and can therefore steer them to the right tool that helps them to solve a particular problem. Those groups or that group is then meets regularly across all the different construction solutions directors so that they can share best practices and learnings and discuss the outcomes of pilots, trials, and whatnot. And they help run the pilot gating process. So long story short, we do keep a pretty close eye. Do we see everything? Probably not. There will always be some jobs that we're trying stuff and we don't know about, but we try and keep a pretty good eye on it, because then what that does is that for the solutions that really work and we really believe in, we may open an investment conversation. We may open a partnership conversation. And so that supplements our ability on just like scanning the market to know what's out there, to sort of say, okay, what's the field using?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I want to shift the conversation a little bit to AI. Before I do that, I forgot to mention when we started, if you have questions, drop them in the chat or the QA button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those in a little bit. But feel free to go ahead and put those in there. So talking AI, I think it's funny if anybody on this call has heard me speak before, I'm very critical of quote unquote AI in the AEC space. I think it's mainly a lot of hype and marketing right now, and there's very little action actually going into those solutions, at least from the startup perspective. And it's kind of weird. I always joke that someone told startups that to have a pitch deck, you need to have the words AI all over it, which I think is completely ridiculous. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on AI and AEC. Like, are there actual advanced innovations happening right now in terms of AI, or are most of the things that you see kind of garbage and more rudimentary elementary solutions?
That's another good question. So I would frame, I don't disagree, but I would frame it differently. I think AI is nascent. If you think about it, data has to feed AI. And if you're not yet in shape as an industry in the data front, then it's really difficult to talk about the AI front, right? I think
Absolutely.
that I think that AI is therefore early, but there are examples of doing real AI, I would say, in the industry. There are not many, but there are a few. I also agree with you, by the way, that there's just a lot of hype. Like, I completely agree that somebody told startups that they need to have AI on their pitch decks. And someone actually ran the study that if you had AI in your pitch decks, you get like 15% more funding or something. So that's like, there's probably a reason
why
they're
they do
doing
it. That's right.
But what we do try to do is that we try and evaluate whether or not they are just words and it's just, rinse and repeat from the common AI environmental topics out there, the buzzwords, right? Versus whether or not there's any real capability. And I would say that there is a handful of companies that have real capability here. Where do I see AI for the AEC industry? I mean, speaking from just the construction side, I think AI has a lot of potential for risk mitigation. One of the earlier talks that I gave has to do with around mitigating risk by using techniques like forecasting, like predictive analytics, and then using AI techniques that are applied to what I call heterogeneous data that is not just simple structured data, so to extract insight and information from it. I think the challenge with construction isn't that data volumes are necessarily high, but its data is very heterogeneous. But to piece together the true situation, you need to be able to process that heterogeneity. So what do I mean by that? We all know that there are construction financials. That's the easiest structured data to kind of think about. But then there is also a lot of text documents that changes hands in construction. That's natural language processing, which is a different technique, right? Machine learning technique. There's a lot of visuals. It's a very tangible job. The job is a very tangible thing. So vision sort of comes into it. Then there is design data, which you could technically call it structured data. I tend to like thinking of it as spatial data, and the way that you might want to think about spatial data is very different. And that's not even factoring in IoT kind of sensor data, which is sort of starting to come online in the construction space. So if I think about all the different heterogeneous data, the AI that applies in construction that I think will be helpful are AI that can help actually interpret a lot of this or extract insight from the heterogeneous data stores. From an application perspective, I think risk mitigation, which then comes into things like prediction, will be big. I think automation is another area that people are looking at. So like think about the huge amount of manual labor to generate field reports, to do all the documentation, etc. And so AI that does expertise automation and can help auto fill in things so that you don't have to type things in lots of times, can help give auto alerts, like when you detect unsafe conditions and whatnot. That could be helpful. I think the major challenge though is that it takes so much resource to do AI that any one startup tends to do like one very specific use case, which in of itself is not enough. You actually need a whole roadmap of use cases that forms are making it up now, like a platform for job alerts, for example, or a platform for what hotspots within your job, or a platform for like quality defects. And I don't think that the point solutions have sort of come together and cohered into a big enough piece, right, to materially impact the job. Each one impacts it in too small a way right now for it to be meaningful. But that might just be the natural point of evolution of where we are.
Yeah, I would completely agree. We see a lot of point solutions, and we struggle, as an investment firm, Shadow generally struggles with, funding these little point solutions because they're not quite big enough to make an impact, and the adoption of a small piece of a larger picture is really tough. So, I mean, how do we move past that? Like, is that something that Suffolk is going to have to take on internally to build kind of some sort of platform to piece these things together? How do you see that happening in the future?
Yeah, that's not a great question. And now I'm really venturing into crystal ball gazing territory, which, as we all know, is a dangerous art form, right? So take this as pure speculation. Sure. I think that part of I'm sure everyone would have seen the research that says as an industry we underinvest in R&D. We underinvest in things that will actually move the industry forwards, rather than just sort of doing things the same way. Part of that is fragmentation. I think the value chain is incredibly complex, necessarily so because a lot of these jobs are very big and require a lot of different expertise. But also I think it's been due to an inability to take full risk on some of these large projects, right? That's kind of originally why the value chain was cut up. I think that to meaningfully progress, whether or not is to invest in a platform that brings the point solutions together, whether or not is, investment in research and development to move the industry forwards, the industry needs to find a way of working together. Too often, I think the conversation is like, why would I do this? I don't get any benefit and my margins are thin, so I'm not going to do it unless you pay me. That's, if that dynamic keeps going, that's just going to be tough, right? So I think the industry needs to decide how it wants to get together to bring the benefits of these types of point solution to, all participants in the value chain. There's a couple of ways it could happen. One is that, leading players from different arenas just sort of cohere together and say, you know what, we're going to jointly work together to do this. Two is that somebody somewhere in the value chain that has the capital wherewithal just says, I'm going to bring together a whole bunch of point solutions. Three, maybe some of the big software giants will be the ones who drive real AI. So your Oracle, Procores, Autodesks of this world, which do hold a lot of data, maybe kind of it's there that they'll come in. And then the fourth solution is somebody might just say, you know what, I'm going to start somewhere, but the only way to do this is to vertically integrate. So I'm going to build a vertically integrated company where I can do this. And there's also been movements in that area, like the Kateras of this world. So different ways in which it could happen. I have seen evidence of all ways of people starting on each one of these. I don't know yet which kind of horse is going to win.
Yeah, for sure. That's funny. I bet if I had to pick one of those that I don't think will win, I'd bet it's the Autodesk and Procores of the world. Not to be too critical of them, but I'd be doing a disservice as a venture capital firm if I bet it on the incumbents of the world, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, Matt, you almost have to take that view, don't you? It's like the
right.
house view.
I have no choice. No, that's super interesting. So when you're talking about a labor, or not necessarily, when you mentioned before, you were talking about using AI to make tasks easier. There's always this rumbling of the labor shortage in the construction market. Do you think first of all, do you think that's true? And second of all, if so, do you see AI helping to mitigate that labor shortage and quote unquote replacing jobs, or are we still a ways off from that?
So first of all, the labor shortage was true. I think it is a little bit too uncertain right now to say whether it will remain true. Certainly, if anyone's been monitoring kind of jobless rates in the broader economic environment, it is just unbelievable how high those numbers have gotten. I think that the way I've always thought about AI, the question around like, is AI going to make jobs away, has always comes up. But what I would say is that construction is one of those industries where the least to worry about AI automating their jobs away for a whole variety of reasons. One was the labor shortage we had going in. Two is just it's a very physical job, right? And very complex environment where you are going to need people on site to direct, to manage, and to actually get the building built. Ironically enough, it's not one of those kind of expertise-based white-collar jobs that are now increasingly at risk from AI, right? Think about the legal profession, accounting professions. A lot of our traditionally what we consider white-collar professional jobs are at risk from the expertise automation trend. I think construction's a really long way for them. So the way I think about AI is for efficiencies, right? That actually help automate and take away some of the manual tasks that no one enjoys doing, and freeing up more capacity to build the complex buildings that the world requires now. I think one of our CEOs had a very insightful quote that he shared, which is that we're building some of the most complex buildings now that we've ever had, with some of the least experienced workforce, because in the last downturn in '08, the industry lost a lot of people that would have come into kind of management positions right around now, and those people that left never came back. So there was a gap in the generational kind of succession, right, for this industry. And so, if anything, AI will help, but it will not replace.
Wow, that's yeah, that's super insightful. So, do you think that that's going to do you think COVID is going to cause that to happen again? Like, are we going to go through another contraction of construction overall, and is the total job market in construction going to shrink down, or do you think we'll come out of it kind of unscathed on the other side of this?
I don't know that anyone can claim that anything's going to come up unscathed on the other side. So I'm not going to go that far. I think construction is one of the industries that are not going to see the worst of COVID. You think about retail, you think about hospitality, you think about travel, and you say that those industries are probably looking at a multi-year recovery, and will not significantly recover probably until we have a viable medical solution. And the timelines of that is harder to call. I think that construction, we went into this down cycle with a lot of momentum. So you talk to construction firms, many have record backlogs, there were labor shortages, we literally just couldn't build fast enough. So momentum was very good going in, and all indications that we've seen so far is that it's paused, but probably not gone away. I mean, there's some cancellations of like new hotels and whatnot, but by and large, the need for housing had been severe. The need for kind of retrofit of existing buildings had been severe. The state of our nation's infrastructure. So you go sector by sector, the underlying demand is very high, and those reasons kind of don't go away. So you might rebalance the sectors a little bit. You'll see a lot less build on the hospitality side, but you're going to see a huge increase in data centers. You're not going to see as much. The retail landscape is going to be severe as everyone moves to e-commerce, but we still have an underlying shortage of affordable housing, right? So I don't think that the construction market, based on what we see today, is going to go through a severe contraction. I think certain sectors will fall, but the sector overall should start recovering, should be one of the earliest to reopen once the immediate threat of infections has tailed off a little bit.
Yeah,
beyond that, it sort of depends. It depends on whether we get an infrastructure bill and what shape that looks like. It depends on what happens to commercial real estate and whether or not the financing of that is going to work. It depends on, frankly, consumer preferences changing. How much is there going to be a flight to e-commerce and obviate the need for physical retail? How much of that, frankly, are we still going to prefer urban environments, and is there a flight to the suburbs? But even there, that's just a rebalancing of multifamily condos to like single family homes in suburban lots, right? So too soon to call, but overall sentiment is cautiously optimistic.
Nice. So has there been anything with, with COVID, with the crisis, technology-wise, that you guys have, that you've accelerated adoption of, or started to look for solutions for, either on the corporate venture side or within your core business?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that we're exploring. I broadly put it into a number of different categories, right? I think a lot of what the CDC guidelines set out, if you think about what essentials businesses like your grocery stores have to do to stay open, there's a whole number of low-cost operational measures, first of all, that we need to adhere to. So frankly, the biggest take-up of technology for us is like the use of Microsoft Teams as a digital collaboration video conferencing tool, right? And I've heard across the board for a lot of construction firms that whether it's Teams or Zoom or some other kind of video conferencing is just in high demand. I think remote monitoring, we saw take off. So remote monitoring, easiest to think of is like 360 cameras, where people, you don't need an owner to show up on site. You put a camera on a hard hat, and if you have the right tool and the right solution, you just sort of see the job, right, virtually. So we are investors in open space, which we really like as a solution, very slick UI. And we've seen owners really kind of really flock to that as a way of kind of remote monitoring the job. I think there are other things that are not construction specific that we are looking to carefully at. Things like temperature testing. You know, we see a lot of places in countries that have gone through this earlier, like in Asia, for example. Temperature testing in a lot of different public buildings upon entry is standardized now, just to sort of check, right? It's one of the earliest signs of potential infection. We're actually seeing greater adoption of wearables maybe, whereas in the past there was resistance against wearables, and wearables are useful to just monitor who's on the job, to monitor in some cases whether or not you are practicing appropriate social distancing, etc. What else from a technology perspective? I think a lot of forms are now requirements. So, you know, the standard forms where you ask people, you know, have you been in contact with an infected person? You know, have you had any signs of temperature? So a lot of we use Power Apps, the Microsoft stack, right? To build sort of simple forms or SharePoint forms or whatever your kind of solution would be. And then I think, you know, those are some of the top of mind solutions, and then a lot of operational measures, kind of hand washing, shift staggering, you know, reducing the kind of maximum capacity of people on the site if you can possibly work that. Those are some of the other operational measures.
Right, right, awesome. So we got about 15 minutes left. I'd like to go ahead and open it up to questions. So we've had a few come in. I think we'll start with George, who wanted to ask his question live. So George, I'm going to unmute you. George, can you hear us? What's your question? No, George. All right, we'll come back to you, George, or feel free to put it in the chat down there. So another question, what does data transparency mean?
Ah, that's a loaded question. So I can tell you what it means for us is that for data transparency, for me, means that you should be open to sharing information and for people to see the same facts so that you have the same bedrock of truth to stand on. But always with, in order to have a conversation, but always with the proper controls, right? So let me just kind of state that out there. We do have different control levels for who's allowed to see kind of what kind of information. I think that, you know, once we define, for us practically what this means is that once we define what we want to look at from a metrics and information perspective for a job, and once we've defined who gets to see it so that you don't have uncontrolled access, then it's about, you know, we want to have the conversation with the information in front of us so that we all understand the reality and not have what often happens is like you know, someone on the job saying, well, the job's going this way and this way and this way, but there's no sort of facts on the table to actually have that conversation. That's what I mean from data transparency. I think there's a couple other people that actually want to answer the question live. Oh, no, sorry, that's you, Matt. Yeah, okay. Hopefully that's helpful to the person who asked the question.
Yeah, good answer. I'm gonna allow George to talk again and see if we can hear him now. George, are you there? No, George still. All right, we'll come back to you, George. I know George likes to ask this question a lot. All right, Miguel says, with your corporate venture investor hat, what types of startups and technologies are you currently interested in or looking for?
Yeah, great question. So our overall investment thesis is anything that drives capital efficiency and improves productivity across the value chain. So, you know, Obviously, we have an expertise, deep expertise in construction, but we also have a small subsidiary that does self-perform. So we're interested in the kind of sub-trades. We have a real estate investment arm. So we're interested upstream on the kind of real estate and property tech side, which is why we define it broadly as the built environment across the whole AEC space. But if you have a technology that can concretely generate productivity improvements or capital efficiency, whether or not that's because you've mitigated some risk and the downstream capital cost is not as high, whether or not you have made something much more efficient. And so, you know, again, you need to spend less time and resource to do a particular thing. We're interested in those. And obviously we have a bias for data companies. So definitely if a real data company doing real AI, very interested in hearing about it.
Absolutely. So another question, what's a high priority gap in Suffolk's dashboard?
Oh, that's a loaded question. We are constantly seeking to improve our dashboards. We believe we have pretty broad coverage right now across many aspects of the job. But I think we're constantly seeking to improve. One thing I'll throw out there is that I think scheduled data, in what I've come across, is one of the hardest data to manipulate, right? It's a complex, it is structured, but it's pretty complex with logic ties and whatnot. And so I would say that if anyone has a better way of spotting potential challenges in schedule, I'd love to sort of hear about it.
Awesome. George, can you talk now?
I think so. I unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yes. Third time.
Oh, so lovely. Sorry about that. So you answered my question about COVID. It seemed to me COVID was a crisis that, you know, shouldn't be wasted in terms of maybe raising awareness for the need of this sort of thing. So it sounds like you're working within your organization pretty effectively, and I see your website, you're sort of in the corporate leadership. Could you, I don't know, maybe just comment about, like, you can have all these great ideas and all these great technologies, but the senior executives in conservative engineering firms, they won't go for it. So like culturally, and also this even on societal level, how does one try to break out, you know, and maybe use a thing like COVID as a way to draw attention, not in a disingenuous or sort of like sensationalist way, but just to get people to freaking pay attention about why this is important, and maybe give it some more momentum, where right now it's heavy on the tech, but low on the adoption because of the cultural. I mean, your personal experience, I guess, within your organization, just a few words.
Yeah, it's always tough. I mean, this one is the perennial question. And I have to say that when you're starting out, when I started out, finding the right business leader with the right mindset towards innovation and tech adoption is important. At the end of the day, any senior executive is going to be concerned about the business from a holistic perspective, and not driving to just use the latest technology if it delivers on an incremental improvement that they believe they can get without the adoption as well, right? And so that's the kind of first thing to say. So starting out, it was important to find the right person. That's a mixture of art and science. You need someone that has skin in the game, maybe because like there was a problem they couldn't solve before with all the old tools, or they need to kind of establish a new direction, or whatever it is, right? Like there'll be a business reason that they'll need to do it, and you need to find that right match to start off, to prove credibility, frankly, more than anything else. And that's kind of falls into the quick wins bucket, which is not necessarily a replacement for long-term sustainable change and major programs, but it helps you get off the ground. I think that on an ongoing basis, being very clear about what value the technology solution delivers quantitatively as well as qualitatively is important. And so I find that a lot of senior operational leaders, you know, if something works, they often don't want to touch it for good reason, because it takes a lot of effort to embed a new process and to ask people to change their behaviors on a day-to-day basis, right? But if you have something that is clearly demonstrated to work, 1 job, 2 jobs, 5 jobs, you can quantize the benefit. If you can get the owner to say great things about it, so if it's an owner visible tool, like the remote monitoring solution I mentioned, I mean, that's great because the owner directly sees it. Then you're starting to generate pull. The last thing I'd offer is that I once saw a great talk, innovation talk, about how you got to understand the psychology of getting people to adopt. And the talk effectively said, is that you got to generate pull by creating this to be like an attractive thing that actually, if you don't have it, it's kind of bad on you, right? And what the guy did, tactically, and what he did was like, he started making things like happen on weekends, and then having people show up, but he made it attractive. And then all of a sudden, like, senior leaders were calling him, and I was like, why did you hold this particular event in this particular location and my people weren't invited? I want to be kind of in too. So he actually built off of the competitive spirit that I think our industry has spades of, and generated a little bit of friendly competition around kind of who was leading on the innovation charge, right? Who was really trying to push the envelope in terms of doing new things. And I found that to be true too in terms of what I do.
That's a great answer. Thank you. I guess one quick follow-up. Do you see, like people say CFO is king now with COVID? In your organization, did you sort of like able to temper that given how much traction and visibility you've been able to get? And sorry, I have another one. You gave a great answer, so I have another one. Generationally in our company, we find that the make it cool and make people feel like if they're on the outside, they're uncool. That takes a much more concrete manifestation when we're talking about, it's a privately held company. We want to keep it that way. We want to find people who are talented to make partners and have them be the next generation. So like they actually, when they buy into the company, they're like, dudes, you need to change how you're doing this. This is old style. And so they have more influence because we want to see them succeed and want the company to continue under their leadership. So whatever you have time to answer. Thanks. Yeah. It's a really good talk.
Yeah, no, both are true. We have also been bringing in a lot of external people into our organization as well. Sorry, your first follow-up question, just quickly remind me.
Yeah, sorry. The CFO business.
Like, the CFO.
Have you been able to balance that?
Yeah, so I've always reported to the CFO, actually, from the moment I came into the organization. I quite like reporting to the CFO because I do think fiscal discipline in innovation is important. And I think oftentimes where innovation can run into trouble is that people are like, yeah, this does this cool thing and it has this value. Who cares if it costs like 100,000 and our margins are 1-2% and 100,000 really matters. I think when you lose the fiscal discipline of how you do innovation, you really run the risk of just getting the reputation of adopting a cool thing because it's cool and not because the value it generates outweighs the cost of it. So I've personally not had a challenge, and we have a CFO that is very kind of forward-leaning and strategic in terms of how he thinks about the value of innovation.
That's also a great answer. I wonder, do you hide the fact that you have a PhD in physics? Does that intimidate all the engineers?
You sound like, so which company are you from again? You sound like you've been down this path quite often.
No, I have no PhD. Let's make that clear. I'll give you a call after. I really enjoyed this talk. Thanks for doing this.
Awesome. I couldn't hide it if I tried, because when I joined, that was very much part of the internal communications. Look, I think how do people view PhDs? It cuts both ways. So just practically, I don't emphasize it, but I don't hide it. So I don't sign on as Dr. Chin everywhere, right?
It was a joke, right? Yeah, I get it.
But like sometimes it's helpful. Like when I talk to MIT, for example, it's helpful.
That's awesome. Thanks, George. Yeah, Jit Kee, I like what you said about having innovation driven from a fiscal perspective. Because I think that's something that a lot of organizations lose sight of, and then it makes it very hard to build a sustainable innovation organization when the bills start rolling in and somebody looks at it and goes, maybe we shouldn't be paying for all this right now. So I think that's a great point.
I just want to build on that. I think it's a viable option, but like many organizational decisions, there are different options. I think I see a lot of also successful ones where you report operationally into an operational leader, someone senior that has the credibility, but is also strategic with the foresight. I've seen that work kind of perfectly well. And then a lot of times it goes up into technology, frankly, or straight up into the CEO. That can happen too, depending on your CEO.
Right. All right, one last question here from the audience. Would you say BIM has reached critical adoption in the US, and are we exploiting its full capabilities? At what project CapEx does BIM generate its efficiencies?
This was a question I was hoping we don't get to because it's a very specific question that I'm not sure that I can answer. Do I think BIM is mature? Yes. Do I think its full potential is achieved? No. And at what CapEx value does it actually deliver savings is, I don't really know. I think it's more complexity based rather than CapEx project value, I suspect. You know, this is the subject of probably an entirely different panel discussion around BIM and how it's gone and where are some of the emerging values, which I'd personally love to engage on, because I think design and spatial data where BIM plays in is one of the most intriguing areas for construction innovation at the moment. But hopefully that somewhat answers that person's question, and I'm sorry I can't give a more in-depth or informed one.
No, fair enough. That's a good answer. All right, well, I think we're right at time here. So Jit Kee, I want to really thank you for taking the time with us today. This was super informative, and I really enjoyed the conversation. I guess to wrap up is, do you want to provide any information on how people can get in touch with you if they're interested in working with Suffolk or anything like that?
Yeah, very straightforward. Just shoot me an email. Matt, I can round back with you to sort of talk about how we distribute it. You know, I don't know kind of whether or not Shadow would kind of take point in gathering the questions from the group or whatnot, but happy to engage.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, I'm happy to run point on that. So if you want to, if you're interested in talking more to Jit Kee, you can feel free to reach out to us at Shadow. You can shoot me an email, mohlman@shadow.bc, and I can, you know, be in the middle of that, those introductions, and we can get you connected if there's mutual interest on both sides. All right, sounds good. Well, thanks again, Jit Kee, and thanks everybody for attending, and have a good rest of your day.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.